Hello everyone and welcome back to today's timeless love reading. As always, remember that this is a collective reading, so not every message will apply to every single person watching. Take only what genuinely resonates with your heart and your own circumstances and simply leave the rest behind. Today's reading feels different. There are actually two completely different emotional energies surrounding you. One feels incredibly gentle. Someone who keeps imagining ways they could make your life easier, more peaceful, more comfortable. They aren't just thinking about romance anymore. They're thinking about taking care of you, almost as though loving you has quietly transformed into wanting to protect you from life's weight. But then, there is another energy. This person doesn't feel peaceful at all. They're overwhelmed, restless, mentally exhausted, and strangely enough, much of that stress seems connected to one question they cannot stop asking themselves. What are you doing right now? We'll uncover both stories as we move through today's cards. And this first card, the Ten of Wands, doesn't actually make me think about burdens. It makes me think about someone who has finally realized just how much you've been carrying by yourself. Sometimes people only understand another person's strength after they've watched them survive everything alone. This card feels like someone quietly replaying all the moments they overlooked. The days you stayed strong without complaining. The nights you dealt with everything in silence. The responsibilities you never talked about. The emotional weight you carried without expecting anyone to rescue you. What's interesting is, this person isn't admiring your independence anymore. They're beginning to question why they allowed you to shoulder so much alone. Almost as if they're looking back and thinking, why wasn't I there? Why didn't I notice? Why did I assume they would always be okay? That's where today's title begins making sense. Because this person doesn't simply miss you. They want to pamper you. Not because they believe you're weak, quite the opposite. Because they finally understand how incredibly strong you've had to become. I almost see someone imagining very ordinary moments. Making sure you've eaten today. Driving instead of letting you travel alone. Buying something small because they remembered you mentioning it weeks ago. Asking how your day really went, instead of assuming everything is fine. Wanting to solve problems before you even have to ask. This isn't about expensive gifts, it's about emotional care. The kind of care that quietly says, you've carried enough, let me carry some of it now. But here's where the energy suddenly changes. Because while one person is imagining how to make your life easier, someone else is becoming increasingly uncomfortable. They're noticing your silence, your confidence, the fact that you seem to be moving forward without explaining yourself. And that uncertainty is beginning to weigh on them just as heavily as these 10 wands. The more they don't know what you're doing, the more their imagination starts creating stories that may not even be true. And the reason why one person wants to nurture and care for you, while the other remains constantly afraid of losing you. What makes this even more interesting is that this feeling hasn't appeared overnight. It's been quietly growing. Almost every day, this person seems to notice one more thing they wish they could have done for you. One more moment where they wish they had shown up differently. And this next part of the story makes me think they aren't measuring love by words anymore. They're measuring it by comfort. Because when someone truly begins to value another person, their imagination changes. Instead of imagining how to be loved, they start imagining how to make someone else's life feel lighter. I almost get the sense that this person catches themselves thinking about the smallest details. Not the dramatic moments, the ordinary ones. Did you remember to eat today? Are you getting enough rest? Have you been carrying too much by yourself again? Who checks in on you when you're the one everyone else depends on? It's almost as though they've begun seeing you through completely different eyes. Before, they admired how independent you were. Now, they wonder how lonely that independence may have felt. There's a quiet difference between those two perspectives. One simply watches your strength. The other wants to protect it. And that's where this energy starts becoming surprisingly beautiful. Because I don't think they're trying to take your independence away. They're trying to make sure you don't have to rely on it every single day. I can almost picture them imagining little moments that most people wouldn't even notice. Opening the car door for you. Bringing you your favorite drink without asking. Taking care of something before it becomes another responsibility on your shoulders. Remembering the conversation you thought they'd forgotten. Looking at your face closely enough to notice you're tired before you ever admit it. None of those things are life-changing on their own. But together, they create something much bigger. They create emotional safety. The kind that quietly says, you don't have to carry everything anymore. But while this person's heart keeps moving toward giving, someone else's mind keeps moving toward fear. And I don't think that's a coincidence, because the less they know about your life, the more they begin trying to fill in the blanks themselves. Silence becomes evidence. A delayed reply becomes a story. Your peace becomes distance. Your confidence becomes proof that you've already let them go. They don't actually know if any of those things are true, but uncertainty has a way of making imagination sound convincing. And I feel like that's exactly what's happening here. They're becoming trapped inside possibilities instead of reality, wondering who you're spending time with, wondering why you seem different, wondering whether someone else has started giving you exactly the kind of care they never did. Because deep down, I don't think they're afraid of what you're doing. I think they're afraid of what your life might look like if you discover you no longer need them. And that's a very important difference. Because if this first energy has been quietly learning how to love through care, and then the other person began to view everything they didn't know as a sign of an impending breakup, and I think that's exactly where these two energies begin moving in completely different directions. Because while one person keeps asking themselves, what if I've already lost them? The other keeps asking, how can I make their life better? Those are very different conversations to be having with yourself. One is driven by fear, the other is driven by care. And this part of the story feels important because I don't think this nurturing energy is about trying to impress you anymore. It feels much quieter than that, much steadier. I almost feel as though this person has stopped imagining special occasions and started imagining ordinary days, not just taking you out somewhere nice, but making sure you don't have to worry about everything by yourself. Sharing responsibilities, showing up when they say they will, being someone you can actually lean on. Because there's something that keeps coming back into my mind. This person doesn't seem to want to become the most exciting part of your life. They want to become the most dependable part of it. And that's a very different kind of love. It's the kind that notices you're overwhelmed before you say anything. The kind that remembers little details because they genuinely matter. The kind that quietly asks, what can I take off your plate today? I even get the feeling they're beginning to picture routines instead of fantasies, cooking dinner together after a long day, running errands without making them feel like chores, laughing over something completely ordinary, building a life that feels peaceful rather than unpredictable. Because after everything they've realized about you, they're no longer chasing moments. They're imagining consistency. They're imagining becoming someone whose presence lowers your stress instead of adding to it. But here's what's interesting. The more this first person's thoughts become grounded, the more scattered the second person's thoughts seem to become, because they keep looking backward. Replaying conversations, replaying decisions, replaying moments they barely thought about at the time. Only now, those same moments feel completely different. Maybe they remember the day you hinted that you were exhausted. Maybe they remember the message they never answered, the invitation they postponed, the conversation they brushed aside because they assumed there would always be another opportunity. At the time, none of those choices felt particularly significant. Now they seem to replay on a loop, because hindsight has a way of turning ordinary moments into painful realizations. And I don't necessarily think they're remembering the big arguments. Sometimes it's the small moments people regret the most. The text they never sent, the kindness they never expressed, the appreciation they assumed you already knew. Because once uncertainty enters the picture, people begin measuring their past very differently. They're no longer asking whether they made one huge mistake. They're wondering whether hundreds of tiny ones slowly created the distance they now feel. And the more that thought settles in, the harder it becomes for them to find any real peace. And we will see how the sorrow of regret can quietly alter a person's state of mind when they do not yet know what place they still hold in your life. And I think that's where the difference between these two people becomes impossible to ignore. From the outside, both of them may seem as though they're thinking about you constantly, but they're not thinking about you in the same way. One person's thoughts leave them asking, what could I do that would make their life easier? The other keeps asking, what if someone else is doing that instead? At first glance, those questions almost sound similar, but psychologically, they come from completely different places. One is rooted in appreciation, the other is rooted in fear. The first person isn't trying to become the center of your world. If anything, they're imagining how they could give you more space to breathe, more stability, more peace. I almost feel like they're beginning to understand that love isn't always about adding excitement. Sometimes it's about removing pressure. Making sure you don't feel alone when life becomes overwhelming. Being the person who quietly says, "I've got this one," without expecting recognition for it. That's the kind of energy that keeps coming through. Not controlling, not demanding, simply present. Because they've realized something that perhaps they didn't understand before. Real care isn't measured by how much attention you receive. It's measured by how safe someone makes you feel. But here's what's interesting. The second person seems to be experiencing almost the opposite realization. The more uncertain they become, the more their mind starts looking for reassurance everywhere. They reread old conversations, looking for clues they might have missed. They think back to the last interaction the two of you shared, wondering if there was a hidden meaning behind something you said, or something you didn't say. Even small changes begin feeling significant to them. If you seem quieter, they notice. If you're happier, they notice. If you're posting less, they notice. If you're posting more, they notice that too. It's almost as though every little change becomes another puzzle they feel they have to solve. Not because you ask them to, because uncertainty makes the mind crave certainty. And when certainty isn't available, people often begin creating explanations of their own. Some days they convince themselves you're simply busy. Other days, they're convinced you've met someone new. Then they question that thought all over again. It's exhausting, because every answer they come up with creates two more questions. Meanwhile, the first person's energy feels remarkably calm by comparison. They're not trying to figure out how to hold on to you. They're trying to become someone worth holding on to. And I think that's one of the biggest emotional differences we've seen so far in this reading. One person is focused on changing your experience. The other is consumed by changing the story inside their own head. But I don't think that's the whole picture. Because there's something about this second person's energy that still hasn't been fully explained. I keep feeling that this isn't just happening inside their imagination anymore. It almost feels as though their curiosity has quietly started turning into actions. There's something else that keeps standing out to me here, and I don't think it's accidental. Because while one person has been imagining how to bring more peace into your life, the other has been trying to imagine what your life looks like without them. Those are two very different emotional paths. It almost feels like they don't realize how often you're crossing their mind. It begins simply, they wonder how you've been, then what you've been doing. Soon they're revisiting old conversations, noticing when you're online, or looking back through messages they haven't opened in months. Not because they're searching for one answer, but because they're hoping something will finally make sense. The less they actually know, the more active their imagination becomes. A delayed reply feels meaningful. A different routine feels suspicious. Silence becomes something to analyze. That's what uncertainty often does. It quietly fills empty spaces with stories. Some hopeful, some fearful, and this person's thoughts become heavier every time they realize they still don't know what's in your heart. Meanwhile, the other energy moves in the opposite direction. I don't feel them gathering information. I feel them gathering understanding. Instead of wondering where you are, they're remembering what you've been through. The moments you said you were tired, and they never asked why. The responsibilities you carried without asking anyone to notice. The times you smiled while hiding far more than people realized. Every memory seems to leave them with the same quiet realization. I wish I had paid closer attention. That's why this energy feels so different. It's not driven by panic. It's shaped by reflection. They're no longer thinking about how you could fit into their life. They're beginning to wonder how they could make your life easier. Not heavier, not more complicated. Simply lighter because they're there. And that's a beautiful shift. But this is where both stories begin crossing. The calmer this first person's intentions become, the more restless the second person seems to feel. Almost as if they sense something changing, without knowing what it is. They check more often, think more often, question more often, not because they've learnt something new, but because they've realized how much uncertainty controls them. Eventually, overthinking stops feeling like enough. People either learn to live with not knowing, or they decide they have to do something about it. And that's exactly where the next part of this story begins. And I think that's exactly why these two emotional stories are becoming more connected than they first appeared. While one person has been quietly changing, the other has been quietly sensing that something feels different, even if they can't explain why. Sometimes people notice emotional distance long before they understand its cause. Not because anything dramatic has happened, but because the feeling itself has shifted. That's what keeps standing out to me here. The first person no longer feels trapped inside wishing. They feel like someone preparing. They've stopped asking, "Do I still care?" That answer already feels obvious. Now they're asking something much deeper. If I ever have another chance, how do I make sure they never have to carry everything alone again? That's a completely different emotional place, because reflection eventually wants to become action. I don't picture them planning grand, romantic gestures. I picture them wanting to become dependable, to be consistent, to show up when they say they will, to listen instead of assuming, to help before being asked, to create a relationship that feels peaceful enough for you to finally exhale. They don't seem focused on impressing you anymore. They want to reassure you, to become someone whose presence brings comfort instead of stress. What's interesting is that this change is happening quietly. No dramatic conversation, no confession, no obvious sign. Everything is shifting internally first, almost like they're becoming the partner they wish they had been before asking for another chance. Meanwhile, the second person seems to sense that internal shift, without understanding what's causing it. And uncertainty becomes even heavier when you feel something changing, but can't explain what it is. So the questions grow louder. Why do I suddenly feel like I'm running out of time? Why can't I stop thinking about them? Why does everything feel different now? They're searching for answers outside themselves, when the real answer may already be within. Because every time they imagine you moving forward, they feel a weight they didn't expect. Not because you've done anything, but because they're finally confronting a possibility they've avoided for too long. Your life could continue beautifully, with or without them. And that's a difficult truth to face. It quietly removes every excuse for waiting, every excuse for staying silent, every excuse for believing there will always be more time. Meanwhile, the first person's energy continues growing steadier. They're no longer reacting from fear. They're responding from understanding. They've stopped wondering what they can receive from this connection and started asking what they can genuinely give. And that's one of the healthiest emotional shifts we've seen in this reading. Because when love begins moving from desire toward responsibility, it often becomes far more sincere. But the pressure building inside the second person hasn't reached its deepest point yet, because I don't think uncertainty is what they're struggling with anymore. I think they're slowly recognizing a truth they still aren't ready to admit to themselves. And I think that's the realization they've been trying to avoid all along. Because it's much easier to ask, "What are they doing?" than to ask, "Why didn't I do something when I had the chance?" Those are two very different questions. One keeps your attention on someone else. The other forces you to face yourself. And I feel like that's where this entire emotional journey has been leading. This person isn't struggling with uncertainty anymore. They're struggling with themselves. The conversations they postponed. The feelings they never shared. The moments they assumed could always wait. We often tell ourselves, "I'll say it later. I'll reach out next week. They already know how I feel." But time has a quiet way of revealing the difference between what we meant to do and what we actually did. Once that awareness arrives, it's difficult to ignore. That's why their thoughts feel so relentless. Not because you're giving them reasons to panic, but because every passing day reminds them of another opportunity they let slip away. Eventually, regret stops sounding like sadness. It begins to sound like urgency. Meanwhile, the other person continues moving in the opposite direction. Their feelings don't seem rushed. They feel grounded, almost as though they've realized that genuine love isn't something you promise. It's something you consistently show. They're no longer focused on winning you over. They're focused on becoming someone whose presence makes your life feel lighter. Someone who remembers the little things. Someone who notices when you're carrying too much before you ever have to say it. Someone who understands that reliability can be more meaningful than excitement. That's why this energy feels so peaceful. It isn't chasing an outcome. It's quietly becoming the person they wish they had been sooner. What's fascinating is the second person seems to sense this change without fully understanding it. They're not necessarily afraid someone else has already entered your life. They're afraid someone eventually could, because they're finally recognizing everything you've always deserved. Someone who listens, someone who notices, someone who stays. And when they compare those qualities to the version of themselves they remember, the comparison becomes difficult. Not because they're a bad person, but because hindsight doesn't only reveal our intentions, it reveals our actions. and actions are much harder to explain away. I can almost feel them replaying old memories. Only now, they're no longer wondering what you meant. They're asking what they meant, why they hesitated, why they stayed silent, why they believed waiting was somehow safer than honesty. Because sometimes pride doesn't look like confidence. Sometimes it looks like waiting too long to say what your heart already knew. And that's the deepest conflict beneath everything we've seen. It isn't really between you and them. It's between the person they used to be and the person they're finally becoming. Meanwhile, the nurturing energy keeps growing quieter, but stronger, less emotional on the surface, yet far more intentional underneath. Their heart no longer wants only to be close to you. It wants to become a source of comfort in your life. And after everything these two emotional stories have revealed, it feels like one of them is finally reaching the point where thinking is no longer enough. Someone is becoming ready to replace silence with communication. And I think that's exactly what all of these moments have been quietly preparing us for, because sooner or later, every feeling reaches a point where staying silent becomes harder than speaking. That's the shift I keep noticing here. The first person isn't questioning whether they still care anymore. They've moved beyond that. Now they're wondering whether they can keep pretending they don't. That's a very different emotional place, because genuine care naturally wants to become visible. Not through grand promises, not through perfect words, but through honest presence. I can almost picture them wanting to send a simple message, to ask how your day has been, whether you've been sleeping well, whether you've been carrying too much again, not because they expect anything in return, but because caring quietly no longer feels like enough. There's something deeply sincere about that. They're no longer imagining conversations that make them feel better. They're imagining conversations that make you feel supported. Their attention keeps shifting toward your well-being, your peace, the little things that make your life feel lighter. Meanwhile, the second person's silence feels very different now. At first, it seemed like a choice. Now it feels like a burden, because every day they wait. Another question appears, another possibility, another imagined future, and slowly they realize something uncomfortable. Silence doesn't stop time. Life keeps moving. People continue healing, growing, finding new routines, discovering new peace. I think they're finally beginning to understand that, not because they've seen proof, but because they've accepted your life has never been standing still. And suddenly, every unsent message feels heavier. Every delayed conversation feels more important. Every excuse feels a little less convincing. Because if they truly don't want to lose their place in your life, they're realizing hope alone won't protect it. What's fascinating is both people are slowly arriving at the same destination, but for completely different reasons. One is moving because love has become calmer. The other is moving because fear has become louder. One wants to give. The other is afraid of losing. And those emotions lead to very different actions. The first person is ready to ask, how can I be there for you? The second is much closer to asking, is it already too late? Neither question appeared overnight. Both have been quietly building throughout this reading. From recognizing everything you've been carrying, to reflecting on missed opportunities, to wondering where you are now. Every card seems connected by the same emotional truth. Real love eventually asks how it can make another person's life easier. Fear keeps asking whether there's still time. And I almost feel like this is the moment these two emotional stories stop running beside each other and finally meet. Because despite how different these two people seem, they're both responding to the same realization. Your life has continued moving forward. Not because you've been trying to prove anything, simply because life doesn't stop while people are deciding how they feel. And that changes everything. One person sees that reality and asks, how can I become someone who brings peace into their life? The other looks at the same truth and wonders, what if I've already waited too long? The same realization, yet two completely different emotional responses. One opens the heart. The other tightens it. One becomes more generous. The other grows more anxious. Throughout this reading, one quiet pattern has continued repeating itself. The more deeply the first person understands your experience, the less love becomes about receiving. It becomes about giving. They're no longer imagining how to be close to you. They're imagining how to help you feel safe, understood, supported, like you no longer have to carry everything alone. That's why this energy feels so steady. Every card has pointed toward healthier love, not louder promises, but more dependable intentions. They're imagining a relationship where comfort becomes part of everyday life, where checking on you isn't a habit. It's simply who they are, because once someone truly sees how much you've been carrying, it's difficult to ignore it. Meanwhile, the second person's journey has unfolded in the opposite direction. The more they realize your life hasn't stopped, the more they confront everything they assumed would always have more time. I think that's where their anxiety truly comes from. Not because they've seen proof you're moving on, but because they've finally accepted that you have every right to. At first, their thoughts sounded like jealousy. Who are you talking to? Where have you been? Has someone else entered your life? But beneath those questions, I don't think another person was ever their greatest fear. The real fear is that someone else could naturally offer you the consistency they failed to give. And that's a much harder truth to face. Because it isn't about circumstances, it's about choices. The moments they stayed silent, the times they assumed, the opportunities they believed would always be there. What's beautiful is that the first person isn't trying to replace anyone. They're trying to replace the loneliness you may have carried for far too long. That brings us back to where this reading began. Someone who finally understands what you've been carrying doesn't immediately dream about romance. They dream about relief, about becoming the person who notices when you're tired, who remembers the little things, who quietly makes your world feel softer. That's why this energy feels so different. It no longer asks, how do I make them love me? It asks, how do I make sure they never have to face everything alone again? Meanwhile, the second person is finally realizing that feelings don't disappear simply because they remain unspoken. Sometimes, they only grow louder in silence. And I think that's the emotional truth every one of these cards has been quietly leading us toward. Not a dramatic ending, not a sudden confession, but a deeper understanding of what these two people have each been learning in their own way. Because if you look back across this entire journey, it almost feels as though neither person's greatest lesson has actually been about love. It's been about responsibility. The first person has slowly come to understand that caring for someone isn't measured by how intensely you feel. It's measured by how consistently you show up. That's why their energy kept becoming calmer instead of louder. Every card moved them a little further away from fantasy and a little closer to intention. They stopped imagining how wonderful it would feel to be loved by you and started imagining how wonderful it would be if you felt genuinely supported because of them. I keep returning to those quiet everyday moments, making sure you're resting, remembering something important you've mentioned, checking in after a difficult day, noticing you're carrying too much before you ever ask for help. Because that's what this entire emotional journey has been pointing toward. Someone whose definition of love has quietly changed from excitement to care, from attraction to protection, from hoping you'll choose them to hoping your life becomes softer because they're in it. And I think that's a beautiful transformation. Meanwhile, the second person's story has been just as important. Not because they've had all the answers, but because they finally stopped running from the questions. For so long, their attention stayed fixed on what you might be doing, who you might be talking to, whether your life had changed. But underneath every one of those thoughts, another question was waiting. What would I have done differently if I had understood all of this sooner? I think that's the question they've been trying not to hear, because it's uncomfortable. It asks them to face hesitation, assumptions, missed opportunities, the belief that there would always be more time. And perhaps that's why they've seemed so restless throughout this reading. Not because uncertainty is easy to live with, but because uncertainty often shines a light on truths we've postponed for far too long. What's interesting is both people have been changed by the same connection. One has become more open, the other has become more honest with themselves. One has learned that love becomes stronger when it gives. The other has learned that silence always has consequences. Neither lesson feels wasted. Because whether these energies reflect your own situation completely, or only certain parts of it, I think there's something meaningful here for all of us. Sometimes the greatest expression of love isn't finding the perfect words. It's becoming the kind of person whose presence brings someone peace, and sometimes the greatest source of regret isn't losing someone. It's realizing you didn't fully appreciate them while you had the chance. So if there's one feeling I hope you carry with you after today's reading, it's this. You deserve relationships where your strength is admired, but your burdens are also noticed. Where your independence is respected, but you never feel like you have to carry everything alone. Where care isn't something that's occasionally offered, but something that's naturally woven into everyday life. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. If this reading resonated with your heart in any way, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next reading together. Until next time, please take gentle care of yourself, and remember, the people who truly value you won't just admire your strength. They'll quietly look for ways to make your life a little lighter. Bye for now!